She glanced over at Storm, her eyes filled with the same fear, but also determination. They had come so far. They had survived the impossible. But could they finish the job? Could they win? The answer, Storm knew, lay in the heart of their final attack. The Kshair's last line of defense was the flagship, the largest, most advanced ship in their fleet. It was their command center, their fortress. If they could destroy it, the Kshair would be crippled, their forces scattered and vulnerable. But getting to it was a whole different story. The flagship was surrounded by a dense web of enemy ships, each one more dangerous than the last. "We need to get to that flagship," Storm said, his voice filled with grim determination. Kayla nodded, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. "I'm in. We can make it through the fleet if we use their blind spots. I studied their formation, and I can guide us through. But we'll need cover." Storm didn't hesitate. "We'll get you there. Just get us close enough." They moved quickly, the freighter cutting through the chaos of the battle, darting between enemy fire and dodging the wreckage of fallen ships. The Kshair's remaining forces were closing in on them, their firepower relentless. The fleet's flagship hovered in the distance, a monstrous presence in the sky, its guns trained on anything that moved. The resistance fleet, still intact despite heavy losses, rallied together. Fighter ships surged forward, taking on the enemy ships with every ounce of strength they had. Every moment brought them closer to the flagship, and every moment was filled with the knowledge that they had one shot at this. If they missed, there would be no second chance. The comms came alive with the voices of resistance fighters, their words a mix of fear and resolve. "We're pushing forward. Storm," General Han's voice crackled over the radio. "We'll cover you as best we can, but you'll need to be fast." "I know," Storm replied. "We've got this. Just keep them distracted for a little longer." The freighter pushed forward, gaining speed as they neared the Kshair flagship. It was enormous, dwarfing everything else around it. The ship's weapons opened fire, massive beams of energy streaking through the sky, barely missing the freighter as it dodged and weaved through the chaos. But Kayla's eyes never left the readout, her fingers moving with precision, calculating their next move. "There's an opening," Kayla said, her voice steady. "Take it." Storm didn't hesitate. He slammed the throttle forward, and the freighter surged into the gap between two Kshair ships, narrowly avoiding their fire. The flagship loomed ahead, its massive guns now tracking their ship, ready to fire. "We have to disable their shields," Storm said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Kayla, can you hack into their systems?" "I'm on it," Kayla replied, her fingers flying over the control panel. Her eyes were locked on the screen, her mind racing through calculations. The enemy shield frequency was constantly shifting, but she knew how to crack it. She'd done it before. Her fingers moved faster, the sweat on her brow mixing with the tension in the air. Then, with a soft peep, the screen lit up. "Got it," Kayla said, her voice a mix of relief and determination. "I've got their shield systems. I'm sending a virus into their mainframe." The freighter shuddered as the virus began to take hold. Storm felt a surge of hope. It was working. The Kshair flagship's shields were beginning to flicker, their once impenetrable defenses weakening. But the Kshair weren't going to let them off so easily. The flagship's guns opened fire once again, this time aiming directly at them. Storm's heart pounded as he slammed the controls to the side, avoiding the blast by inches. The freighter rocked violently, but it held steady. "We're almost there," Storm gritted out, his teeth clenched. "Hold on, Kayla. I've almost got it," Kayla said through gritted teeth. Her hands moved in a blur, entering code after code, every keystroke bringing them closer to their goal. Just a little longer. Finally, with a triumphant beep, the Kshair flagship's shields collapsed entirely. It was wide open. "Now," Storm shouted, his voice filled with adrenaline. Kayla didn't need any further instructions. She pressed a button, and the freighter's main cannons fired, their energy blasts ripping through the air. The first shot struck the flagship's central core, sending shockwaves through the massive vessel. The second shot hit its command center, and the flagship began to break apart, its hull groaning under the strain. The girl's eyes darted around, and for a moment, it looked like she might run in the opposite direction. But then, to his surprise, she reached into her tattered clothing and pulled out a small device. It looked like a simple piece of metal, no bigger than her hand. She held it tightly and whispered something Storm didn't understand. Before he could ask her what she was doing, the world around them shimmered, and suddenly they were cloaked in a field of energy, hidden from sight. Storm froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what kind of technology she had just activated, but it worked. The guards passed by, their heavy boots stomping against the ground just a few feet away from them, unaware of their presence. For a moment, everything was silent except for the pounding of Storm's heart and the soft, shallow breathing of the girl beside him. "What was that?" Storm whispered, looking at the girl in disbelief. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she lowered the device and looked up at him with a strange, almost mystical gaze. Her lips trembled, but she finally spoke in a voice so soft it was barely audible. "It's a cloaking device. I know how to use it." Storm blinked, taking in what she said. It was clear now that she was no ordinary slave. There was something about her that didn't add up. She wasn't just a victim. She was dangerous in her own way, but also powerful. "Where did you get this?" Storm asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl shook her head, her eyes filled with an unspoken pain. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "I need to get out of here." Storm nodded. He understood. They needed to move, fast. They darted through the alleys, moving quietly but swiftly. Storm led the way, his instincts sharp, while the girl followed closely behind. They had to reach the old freighter docked at the edge of the city, Storm's only escape route. But as they neared the docks, disaster struck. An explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending a wave of heat and dust into the air. Storm instinctively grabbed the girl and pulled her down, shielding her from the blast. The shockwave sent them both tumbling into the street, but somehow they managed to get back on their feet. "We need to move," Storm shouted, already pulling her toward the entrance of the hangar. He didn't know what had caused the explosion, but he knew it was the beginning of something bigger. The share would be coming for them, and they would come fast. As they reached the hangar, Storm could see the freighter in the distance, but before they could reach it, another blast struck the ground ahead of them. The sky above was filled with the glow of incoming share reinforcements, massive warships descending from the sky. "We're not going to make it," Storm muttered to himself, but then he looked down at the girl. She was still holding the device, her face determined, but also terrified. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the explosions. Storm hesitated for a moment. He had always worked alone, but something about this girl, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, sparked something inside him. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this, together. He took her hand. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "Stay close to me." With that, they rushed forward, dodging the explosions and moving toward the freighter. The share were closing in, and the fight for their lives was about to begin. The harsh sound of explosions still echoed in the distance, shaking the ground beneath David Storm's boots as he pulled the girl, Kayla, through the debris-strewn streets. The city of Xanthar was burning, consumed by chaos, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and something worse, something that tasted like fear. It was everywhere, in every corner of this war-torn city. They had to escape. There was no choice. The freighter was their only hope. It was a battered, old ship, tucked away in the hangar on the far side of the city. Storm had been planning to use it for his own escape after completing the mission, but now it was the only way out for both him and Kayla. He had no idea what had happened to the rest of his team, and frankly, he didn't care. All that mattered now was getting the girl to safety. As they ran, Storm couldn't help but glance over at her. Kayla was thin, her frame fragile-looking, but there was something about the way she moved that made it clear she was more than just a scared slave. There was strength in her, something hidden beneath the surface. She had already proven that when she activated the cloaking device to hide them from the Ekshare guards. But there was more to her than that, something he couldn't put his finger on. Kayla looked up at him, her wide blue eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and determination. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Storm had seen it before. Many of the slaves he had rescued over the years had been too traumatized to speak at first. She was in shock, and he couldn't blame her. She had just been freed from a life of slavery, only to find herself in the middle of a war zone, with no one she could trust but a human soldier. "We're almost there," Storm said, trying to reassure her as they sprinted across the ruined street. He wasn't sure if she understood him, but he hoped his tone would comfort her. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a dark silhouette in the distance. The Ekshare were close. They had to hurry. The hangar was only a few blocks away now, but it might as well have been miles. The streets were a maze of rubble and fire, and the air was thick with smoke. Storm could barely see ahead, but he kept moving forward, his instincts kicking in as he led Kayla toward the freighter. Then, a sudden crackle of static burst through his earpiece, followed by a voice. It was one of his team members. "Storm, do you copy? This is Lieutenant Hayes. We're in trouble. Share forces are closing in on us fast. We're pinned down in the eastern sector." Storm cursed under his breath. He had no time for this, but he couldn't just leave his people behind. They had been in this together from the start, and he owed them. He stopped in his tracks, turning to Kayla. "I have to help them," he said, more to himself than to her. Kayla looked at him, her eyes pleading. She didn't understand, but she could feel the weight of his decision. She reached out, grabbing his arm, trying to stop him. But Storm shook his head. "We'll come back for you. You'll be safe on the ship, I promise." He didn't wait for her response. Storm took off in the direction of the eastern sector, his mind racing with thoughts of his team. Kayla was still a mystery to him. He didn't know what she was capable of, but he couldn't leave her alone, especially with the Ekshare forces on their tail. He just had to trust that she could handle herself for a little while. As he ran, the sounds of battle grew louder. The Ekshare forces were everywhere. Storm could hear the hiss of alien weapons, the pounding footsteps of their mechanized soldiers, and the deafening roar of their warships in the sky above. They had complete control of the planet, and there was no one to stop them. Storm reached the eastern sector in minutes, his mind focused solely on his team. The Ekshare soldiers were everywhere, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But Storm had fought against worse odds before. He wasn't about to back down now. He quickly surveyed the area, spotting his team hiding behind a crumbled building. They were surrounded, trapped. The Ekshare had them pinned down, and it didn't look like they had much time. "Hayes, on my mark," Storm whispered into his earpiece, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "I'll create a distraction. You get to the freighter." The reply came quickly. "Copy that. Storm, we're counting on you." Storm grinned grimly to himself. He didn't plan to fail. He was going to make sure they all got out of here alive. He moved swiftly, crouching low as he made his way toward a pile of debris near the Ekshare's position. The soldiers didn't notice him at first. Storm's combat training kicked in, and he moved like a shadow, unseen and unheard. He reached a perfect vantage point and pulled out a grenade from his belt. With a quick flick of his wrist, he threw it toward the Ekshare soldiers. The explosion was deafening. The Ekshare soldiers were thrown into disarray, scrambling to find cover as Storm took advantage of the chaos. He fired his weapon, taking down one alien after another with precise shots. His team, seeing their opportunity, began to push forward, using the distraction to their advantage. But just as things were starting to turn in their favor, something unexpected happened. A massive blast erupted from the sky. The Ekshare warship had spotted them, and it was opening fire. The blast sent Storm flying backward, slamming him into the ground. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything seemed to spin. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he managed to pull himself to his feet. His ears were ringing, and he could barely hear the crackle of static in his earpiece. But then he heard something that made his heart race. "Storm, they're coming for you," Hayes shouted over the comms. "Get to the freighter now." Storm's mind cleared, and he took off toward the hangar. There was no time to waste. The Kshair were closing in, and his team needed the ship. They had to get out. As he ran, the sounds of battle faded into the background. His only focus was getting to the freighter, getting Kayla, and getting off this hellhole of a planet. He knew that if they didn't leave now, they would be caught, and all of them would be killed. He reached the hangar, and to his surprise, Kayla was already there, standing by the ship. She had somehow made it through the chaos on her own. Her face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was ready. "Let's go," Storm said, his voice gruff but relieved. He didn't know how she had managed it, but he wasn't about to question it. The ship's hatch opened with a loud hiss, and Storm motioned for her to climb inside. She did so without hesitation, and Storm followed closely behind her. But before the hatch could close, the ground shook beneath them. A Kshair warship had landed nearby, its engines roaring to life. They were surrounded. Storm gritted his teeth. "We're not done yet." He rushed to the cockpit, his mind racing as he powered up the ship. He could hear the sounds of the Kshair soldiers approaching, their footsteps heavy and determined. But they weren't going to stop him. The ship's engines roared to life, and with a sudden jolt, they were airborne. Storm slammed the throttle forward, taking the ship higher and higher, breaking through the atmosphere and into space. As they escaped the planet's atmosphere, Storm allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had made it. The Kshair might have controlled Xanthar, but for now, they were free. But as he glanced over at Kayla, he knew their journey was far from over. She was no longer a scared slave. She was his partner, and together, they were going to fight to the end. "We're safe for now," Storm said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "But we're not done. Not by a long shot." Kayla didn't say anything, but her eyes spoke volumes. She understood. They had just begun. The stars outside the cockpit were a vast, endless sea of lights. It was a view David Storm had seen countless times before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, the stars weren't just cold, distant pinpricks in the dark. Tonight, they symbolized freedom. Freedom from the chaos that had torn Xanthar apart, and freedom from the relentless war that had defined Storm's life for so long. Storm sat at the controls of the old freighter, his hand steady despite the chaos they had just escaped. Beside him, Kayla was silent, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the ship. She had hardly spoken since they had lifted off, and Storm wasn't sure if it was because she was still in shock or if she simply didn't know what to say. The freighter hummed softly as it cruised through the void of space. The hangar doors had closed behind them, sealing them away from the planet that had been their prison for so long. The Kshair forces were still hunting for them, but for now, they were safe. Or at least, that was what Storm hoped. "Where do we go now?" Kayla's voice broke the silence, soft and unsure. It was the first time she had spoken since they had boarded the ship. Storm glanced at her, surprised by the sound of her voice. He had almost forgotten she was sitting next to him. "We lay low for now," he replied. "Get some distance from Xanthar, and then we figure out what to do next." Kayla nodded, but her eyes remained distant. There was a sadness there, an unspoken grief that Storm could feel but couldn't understand. She had been through so much. It wasn't just the Kshair that had broken her. There was something deeper, something hidden in her past that she wasn't ready to share. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For saving me." Storm didn't know how to respond. He had saved her, yes, But he hadn't done it out of some sense of heroism or selflessness. He had done it because he couldn't stand to see another soul broken by the Kshair. He had done it because he had always fought for what was right, even if it meant going against orders. "We're in this together now," he said, keeping his tone simple and honest. "You don't have to thank me." But Kayla wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the stars, something that only she could see. She seemed lost in thought, as if her mind was far away. And in a way, it probably was. Storm couldn't blame her. He had seen the same haunted look in the eyes of soldiers after their first battle, the look of someone who had witnessed too much and didn't know how to process it. "You're not like the others," Kayla said suddenly, breaking the silence again. "The other humans, I mean. The ones who fought the Kshair. You're different." Storm raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Kayla hesitated, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her sleeve. "You don't seem like you're fighting for a cause. You don't seem like you're fighting for anything but survival." There it was again, that sense of sadness in her voice, mixed with something else. Was it fear, confusion, or perhaps curiosity? Storm leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Maybe that's all any of us are doing," he said, his voice quiet. "Surviving." But Kayla didn't look convinced. She turned her gaze toward him, her eyes searching. "But why help me? Why risk your life for someone you don't know?" Storm took a deep breath. This was the question he had been avoiding. Why had he done it? Why had he risked everything to save a stranger? The answer wasn't simple, but somewhere deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just because she was a slave, or because he couldn't stand the injustice of what the Kshair were doing. It was more than that. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "Maybe I just saw something in you. Something different." Kayla looked down at her hands, as if trying to make sense of his words. Then she nodded, as if accepting his answer, though she still didn't seem entirely satisfied. The silence stretched between them again, but it was different this time. It wasn't awkward. It was more like two people, both lost in their own worlds, trying to figure out what came next. After a while, Storm turned his attention back to the controls, scanning the ship's readouts. The freighter was holding steady, but they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to make a plan, and they needed to do it fast. Kayla broke the silence once more. "You said we lay low," she began, her voice hesitant. "But what if the Kshair find us? What will we do then?" Storm's eyes narrowed. He had been thinking about that too. The Kshair were relentless, and their forces were vast. Even if they managed to outrun them for a while, it wouldn't be long before they caught up. "We'll have to fight," he said simply. "We'll find a way to fight back." Kayla looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Fight? But you're only one person. What can you do against them?" Storm turned to face her fully, his expression hardening. "I've fought against impossible odds before. I've seen soldiers die, entire colonies fall to the Kshair, but I'd also seen them fail. They're not invincible." Kayla didn't respond immediately, but her eyes were locked onto his, as if trying to understand him. For the first time, Storm realized something important. Kayla wasn't just a victim of the Kshair's cruelty. She had been a part of their system, a cog in their machine. But now she was free. And maybe, just maybe, she was the key to something bigger than either of them had imagined. "What if I could help?" Kayla said suddenly, her voice small but firm. "What if I could help you fight?" Storm stared at her, taken aback by her words. "You don't know how to fight. You've never even held a weapon." Kayla's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes glinting with something fierce. "I may not know how to fight with a gun or a blade, but I know how to survive. And I know the Kshair. I've seen their weaknesses. I know how their systems work." Storm's mind raced. She was right. He didn't know much about the Kshair's inner workings. He had been trained to fight them, but their technology, their tactics, it was always evolving, always shifting. Kayla had been a part of their system. She knew things that could be valuable. I don't know what you're capable of, Storm said slowly. But if you're serious about this, we need to start thinking like allies, not enemies. We need to trust each other. Kayla nodded. I'm ready. I want to help. For the first time since he had met her, Storm saw a fire in her eyes that matched his own. She wasn't just a scared slave anymore. She was a warrior, in her own way. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't just the two of them sitting in the cockpit of a freighter, lost in space. They were partners now, unlikely allies, perhaps, but allies nonetheless. And together, they would fight. Storm turned back to the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons as he plotted their next move. He didn't know exactly where they would go or what they would face, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. A real chance. Let's get to work, he said, his voice steady. Kayla didn't say anything, but her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time she smiled. The hum of the freighter's engines filled the cockpit, a steady, comforting sound as David Storm stared out into the vast emptiness of space. It was quiet now, but the silence between him and Kayla felt heavy, full of questions neither of them had voiced aloud. He was still processing everything. What had happened on Xanthar, what had happened to his team, and what the future held for him and Kayla. They had been flying for hours now, heading deeper into uncharted space. The farther they went from the war-torn planet, the more isolated they became. It was hard to tell if that isolation was a blessing or a curse. On one hand, it meant they were out of the reach of the Kshair forces. On the other, it meant they were alone. Just two people against an entire galaxy that seemed to have forgotten them. Kayla sat across from him, her head down, her eyes distant as she fiddled with a small device in her hands. It was a simple, worn-out piece of tech, but Storm knew it was important to her. He had seen her tinker with it for hours, but she hadn't explained what it was or what it did. She had kept to herself, and Storm didn't push. They both had their ghosts to deal with, their secrets. He had been thinking about what she had said earlier, that she wanted to help, that she could be an ally. He still didn't know what to make of it. Kayla had been a slave, nothing more than a possession to the Kshair. How could she possibly know enough to fight back against them? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. Kayla was different. There was more to her than met the eye. And maybe, just maybe, she had information he needed. What are you working on? Storm asked, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, not wanting to startle her. Kayla glanced up at him, her eyes flicking to his for a moment before looking back down at the device in her hands. It's a communications relay, she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. I'm trying to fix it so we can contact the Resistance. Storm raised an eyebrow, surprised by her words. The Resistance? You mean there's a group of people still fighting the Kshair? Kayla nodded, her fingers moving expertly over the device. There are pockets of resistance spread out across the galaxy. Some are on planets the Kshair haven't fully occupied. Others are hidden, operating from the shadows. But they're out there. I've been in contact with them. At least I was before I was captured. The words hung in the air between them. Storm leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. He had heard rumors of resistance movements, but they were always just whispers. Rumors passed between soldiers, like a flicker of hope in an endless darkness. He never thought they were real. But Kayla's words gave him a new sense of purpose. There were others out there, others who were fighting. How do you know about them? Storm asked, his voice careful. Were you a part of them? Kayla hesitated, her fingers stilling over the device for a moment. She looked up at him, her face a mask of uncertainty. I was, in a way, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. I worked for the Kshair, but not because I wanted to. I was a part of their infrastructure. I was a technician, fixing and maintaining their communication networks. But I knew what they were doing. I saw the damage they caused, the lives they destroyed. I couldn't just stay silent. I had to do something. Storm felt a surge of respect for her. He had known that Kayla was different, but hearing her speak about her past, about her courage in the face of the Kshair's brutality, made him realize just how much she had endured. She wasn't just a victim. She had fought back in her own way. And now she was offering to help him in a war she had once been forced to serve in. "You were a spy," Storm said quietly, his voice full of understanding. "You were feeding information to the Resistance." Kayla nodded, her eyes darkening as she spoke. "Yes, I did what I could when I could. I gathered intel, sabotaged their systems whenever I had the chance. But when the Kshair found out, they captured me. They imprisoned me, broke me. They tried to make me forget who I was, but they couldn't." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but she didn't look away. She held Storm's gaze with a quiet strength, and for a moment, he saw the girl she had been, the girl who had fought against impossible odds and had survived. "I was lucky," she continued, her eyes dropping to the device in her hands. "I was eventually sold into slavery, but even then, I kept working. I kept looking for ways to fight back. And when you came, when you rescued me, it felt like a second chance, like I could finally do something that mattered." Storm was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. He had never known the depth of her past, never realized just how much she had suffered. In his mind, Kayla had always been a victim, someone he had saved from the horrors of slavery. But now, he understood that she was so much more than that. She was a survivor, and she was offering him a chance to do more than just run from the Kshair. She was offering him a way to fight back. "You're not just a survivor, Kayla," Storm said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a warrior." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand his words. "A warrior," she repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I don't know if I can be that." Storm gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You already are." Kayla didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to the device in her hands, her fingers moving swiftly over the broken pieces of technology. "I've been working on this relay for hours," she said, her voice now filled with determination. "If I can fix it, we can contact the Resistance. We can get the help we need to take down the Kshair." Storm nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to turn the tide of the war, to strike back against the alien invaders who had destroyed everything. But there was one thing he needed to ask, one thing that had been nagging at the back of his mind since Kayla had first mentioned the Resistance. "Kayla," Storm said, his voice low, "if you knew about the Resistance, if you were a part of it, why didn't you just escape when you had the chance? Why stay with the Kshair? Why not tell us sooner?" Kayla's hand stilled once again, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. She was lost in thought, her gaze unfocused, her mind far away. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression somber. "I didn't escape because I couldn't," she said quietly. "The Resistance was small, fragmented. I had to stay inside the system, close to the heart of the Kshair's power. If I had escaped, they would have found me, and they would have made sure the Resistance could never operate again. I had to bide my time, wait for the right moment. And that moment, it's now." Storm's heart raced with the weight of her words. Everything had been building toward this point. The revelation of the Resistance, Kayla's role in it, her survival against all odds. It all led to this moment. They weren't just running from the Kshair anymore. They were fighting back. They had a chance to change everything. "I don't know what's coming next," Kayla said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying fear. "But I do know one thing. We can't fight them alone." Storm nodded, his mind made up. He didn't know where this fight would lead or how they would take on the Kshair's vast empire. But with Kayla at his side, and with the Resistance as their ally, he finally felt like they had a fighting chance. "We won't be alone," Storm said, his voice filled with certainty. "We'll make sure of it." The stars outside the cockpit flickered as the freighter's engines hummed steadily through the void of space. The silence between Kayla and David Storm felt different now, heavier, more intense, like the calm before a storm. They had done it. They had made contact with the Resistance, and now the next part of their journey would begin. But the cost was high. The Kshair knew they had escaped. It was only a matter of time before they came after them. Storm leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the navigation panel. Their course was set. They were headed for a distant planet, a hidden stronghold where the Resistance had been gathering forces. It was their last hope. But it was also a trap. The Kshair were closing in on them, and Storm knew that they would not be able to avoid the coming battle for long. The time for running was over. Now, they would stand and fight. Kayla sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the communications relay. She had spent hours working on it, and it was finally operational. The Resistance had responded to their call, and they had a plan. But it was risky, dangerous, even. There was no guarantee they would survive what was coming. "We can't keep running forever," Kayla said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. She had become stronger over the past few days, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. The fear that had once clouded her eyes had been replaced with a fierce fire. She was ready to fight. Storm looked over at her, his gaze softening. He could see the change in her, the transformation from a broken slave to a fierce warrior. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was someone who had found her purpose. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "We fight back now. It's the only way." But there was still doubt in his mind. Even as confident as he tried to sound, he knew how dangerous the Kshair were. Their forces were vast, and their technology was far superior to anything humanity had. They had fought back before, but they had never faced the full might of the Kshair fleet. What if they weren't enough? What if they were walking straight into a massacre? Kayla must have sensed his hesitation. She looked up from the relay, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "You're not alone in this, David," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We're in this together. We've come this far. We can't stop now." Her words rang in his ears. He wasn't alone. He had Kayla. And now, they had the Resistance. Together, they could make a difference. The Kshair might have advanced technology, but they didn't have the will to fight like humanity did. They didn't have the same hunger for freedom, the same drive to survive. Storm leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "I'm with you," he said. "Let's do this." The Resistance base was located on a barren, rocky planet on the edge of the known galaxy. It was a place that no one would look twice at. A perfect hideout. Storm and Kayla had arrived a few hours earlier, and now they were waiting. The rendezvous was set. The Resistance would bring their forces, and they would all fight together. Storm had a bad feeling. He knew that the Kshair would be coming soon. The question was, how soon? They had been working on their plans for days, and it wasn't long before the warning came through. "They're coming," Kayla said suddenly, her voice low and tense. She was sitting beside the communication relay, her hands flying over the controls as she scanned the incoming signals. Her eyes widened as she listened intently. "I've confirmed it. The Kshair fleet is approaching." The news hit Storm like a punch to the gut. He had expected the Kshair to come, but hearing it confirmed made it real. It was happening. They were going to fight. "We need to move now," Storm said urgently. "Get the Resistance on the line. We're going to need every hand we can get." Kayla nodded and quickly sent out a call to the Resistance forces. They had prepared for this, but preparation could only go so far. Storm knew that this was it, the final stand. They had to hold their ground. If they didn't, everything they had fought for would be lost. The Resistance fighters arrived soon after, their ships landing in the rocky terrain. They were a ragtag group, people from all walks of life. Some soldiers, some civilians, all united by the same goal, to take down the Kshair. The Resistance leaders quickly gathered around Storm and Kayla, outlining their plan. "We don't have much time," said General Han, the leader of the resistance. His voice was rough, his face weathered by years of battle. "The Kshair are coming in fast. We need to hit them hard, and we need to do it now." Storm listened intently, his eyes scanning the group. They had one shot at this. If they failed, there would be no coming back. The stakes had never been higher. "We'll strike their main fleet first," General Han continued. "It's their most vulnerable point. If we can take that out, the rest of their forces will be crippled. We've already planted explosives on their main shipyard. If we can get close enough to detonate them, we might just stand a chance." Storm's mind raced. It was a bold plan, one that had a slim chance of success, but it was their best option. "Kayla," Storm said, turning to her, "what about you? You're the one who knows the Kshair systems better than anyone. Can you get us into their main fleet?" Kayla nodded, her expression hardening. "I can get us in. I know their frequencies, their vulnerabilities. I've hacked their systems before." Storm's heart skipped a beat. "Good. Let's move out then. We don't have much time." The battle began with a deafening roar. The skies above the resistance base lit up as the Kshair fleet descended upon them, a massive wall of alien ships descending from above. The resistance fighters scrambled to their positions, their weapons ready, their ships primed for the fight of their lives. Storm and Kayla were in the heart of it, their freighter racing toward the Kshair's main fleet. The ship's engines screamed as they cut through space, dodging enemy fire as they closed in on their target. The Kshair's ships were huge, their metallic hulls glinting in the starlight, their weapons primed to destroy anything in their path. "We need to disable their main reactor," Storm shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Kayla, do you have a clear shot?" Kayla's eyes were locked on the controls, her fingers moving rapidly as she hacked into the Kshair's systems. "I'm in. I've got the code. We'll have a clear path to the reactor in 3-2. The ship rocked violently as enemy fire struck it. Storm gripped the controls, his knuckles white with tension. "Hold on," he shouted, pulling the ship back on course. They were so close now. They couldn't afford to lose their focus. Kayla's fingers flew over the console. "Almost there," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "Just a little more." And then everything changed. The Kshair's massive warship exploded in a burst of light, the shockwave hitting their ship with full force. Storm's heart raced as the ship jolted under the blast, but Kayla held steady, her eyes locked on the readout. "We did it," Kayla breathed, a small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her lips. The Kshair fleet was in disarray now. Without their main reactor, their ships were powerless, and the resistance forces quickly pounced, launching a full-scale assault. The skies above the planet were filled with the sounds of explosions, the flash of laser fire, and the distant rumble of combat. Storm watched as the Kshair ships began to fall, one by one. It wasn't over yet, but they had done it. They had struck a blow that would be felt across the galaxy. But the cost was high. The battle raged on, and the loss of life was staggering. Resistance ships exploded in the sky, and the ground shook with the force of the battle. There was no way to avoid the consequences of war. Through the chaos, Storm found Kayla once again. She was standing by the communication relay, her face grim as she watched the fight unfold. "We did it," Storm said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've beaten them." Kayla nodded, but there was no joy in her eyes. "Not yet," she said quietly. "The fight's not over." Storm nodded, understanding the weight of her words. This was just the beginning. But together, with the resistance, they had made their stand, and they would keep fighting until the Kshair were defeated. The final stand had begun, and no matter the cost, they would not back down. The battle had raged for hours. The sky above the barren planet had become a war zone, filled with the flashing of laser fire, the explosions of fallen ships, and the unrelenting roar of combat. David, Storm, and Kayla stood side by side, their faces covered in sweat and grime, their eyes locked on the chaos unfolding before them. The fight was far from over, but the resistance had struck a powerful blow. The Kshair's massive warships were falling one by one, their once imposing fleet now a scattered mess of debris and burning wreckage. Despite the victories, there was still so much at stake. The battle was far from won. The Kshair weren't going to give up easily. They had their pride, their strength, and they would fight to the bitter end. Storm gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He had seen so much death in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was humanity's last stand. This was the moment when they either won or lost everything. Beside him, Kayla was still focused on the task at hand. Her hands flew over the controls of the freighter, her mind working quickly to keep the ship in one piece. She had been in charge of communications for the Resistance, working tirelessly to coordinate their forces and keep the fleet in the fight. But even with her expertise, she couldn't ignore the raw, primal fear that had taken hold of her. The Kshair had come for them all. They had taken so much from her already, and now they were going to take more unless they fought back.